Good evening, I'm Christian Esguerra, and welcome to this episode of After the Fact, where we get to see things more clearly, where we get a better sense of the truth. Let's begin by dissecting the news. The son and namesake of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos has widened his lead in the latest Pulse Asia pre-election survey on presidential candidates in the May elections. Marcos Jr. got 60% nationwide and registered double-digit leads across socio-economic groupings and geographic areas. Vice President Leni Robredo came in second with 16% nationwide. She also garnered double-digit numbers in classes C, D, and E, and across the country except for Mindanao. Senator Manny Pacquiao and Manila Mayor Isko Moreno each had 8%, while Senator Panfilo Lacson had 4%. Now, what's fueling Marcos Jr.'s numbers despite picking and choosing media interviews and ignoring debates? Not to mention the campaign baggage of his family's ill-gotten wealth and history of atrocities during his father's martial law regime. Be part of our discussion. Send us your questions and comments on our YouTube live chat or tweet us using the hashtag ANC After the Fact. Joining us tonight is Pulse Asia President Ronald Holmes. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us again on the program.
Good evening, Christian.
Let's put this in context. 60%. Is this the highest ever garnered by a presidential candidate based on your surveys?
In Pulse Asia, since we started tracking pre-election preferences for the presidential race, this is the highest, yes. So this is from 2004 elections, 2010, and 2016 elections.
Okay, so this was conducted last January 19 to 24, less than 4 months before the actual elections on May 9. Others are already thinking, based on their reaction on social media, that perhaps the race is over. You have a clear winner here. They're just waiting for the formality of the actual elections on May 9. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't think that the race is over. The race is going to be decided on May 9, 2022, and previous surveys will show that there are changes in subsequent surveys that would really depend on events that would transpire. Let's say from the beginning of the campaign, which was last week, until the last day of the campaign, which is, if I'm not mistaken, on May 6 or 7. So there's a lot of developments, Christian, that may influence shifting or may shift voting dispositions.
Okay, this was conducted before the start of the official campaign period for national candidates on February 8, right?
Yes.
Did this already take into account, let's say, the refusal by Bongbong Marcos to join the first major media interview conducted by GMA7, which was last January 22?
So that came about a couple of days into the field work, or the last 2 days of the field work. So it may not have had that much of an impact in terms of the voting decision that is captured by the survey. Kindly note also, Christian, that for much of the duration of January, campaign activities of many of the presidential candidates were actually quite suppressed, given the surge in terms of COVID-19 cases. So what we do know is that there were certain statements, largely to virtual media, to social media, to traditional media, but there were not that many barnstorming activities that transpired. And then the first forum or interview was held just 2 days before we ended the fieldwork.
So in this case, this fieldwork was conducted during the time when you said the campaign activities were suppressed or subdued because of the pandemic, because of the surge. So what do you think fueled this high number for Bongbong Marcos? Was it name recall or social media-driven campaign?
I would say that it would be campaign through various media, basically indirect campaign strategies, either through traditional or through social media. And that basically applies to most of the candidates. It may be advertisements in either traditional or social media. The change in terms of his preference is not that it's statistically significant, but if you look at it, it's just an incremental 7 percentage point change. The other candidates, there's no significant change in terms of their voting support.
But in the case of Leni Robredo, it actually went down 4%. 4 percentage points.
It's within the survey to survey margin of error.
Okay, so basically the same.
Yes, yes, virtually
Statistically, the
unchanged
same for her.
for Vice President Robredo, for Senator Pacquiao, for Mayor Demagoso, and for Senator Lacson.
Now, technically, the fact that, let's say, candidates like Bongbong Marcos pick and choose which particular interviews to grant, which particular forums to attend, and whether he would actually show up in debates. Do these decisions or actuations matter in terms of numbers during pre-election surveys?
It will depend on how much their performance during those debates or interviews will be basically disseminated to various media, Christian. I don't know what proportion of the public will really be watching or listening to presidential interviews or debates, either on radio or television. Maybe most Filipinos will just be listening to the reports, the news reports. So it will really depend on whether those news reports will assess their performance either positively or negatively. And there's a range of reportage in terms of performance and interviews, right? There are people there are journalists or broadcasters that are quite objective. On the other hand, there are journalists that will praise to the high heavens certain candidates that may not have actually performed well in an interview or debate. So you cannot expect people to be attentive to, let's say, a presidential forum or debate that will last for, let's say, 2.5 hours. It will really be the reports, and the reports would be, or the snippets of those interviews that will be captured in social media or traditional media.
So basically, the framing will be decided by those snippets or reports that you're talking about.
It's the way that their handlers or the ones that they tap to really bolster their narrative will disseminate whatever they did during those interviews. So people are saying, for example, that one candidate did not perform well because he did not make any pronouncements about his program of action. But that might be cast in a different light by someone who's working for that candidate, not really directly, but as a publicist, no, as a secret publicist for that matter.
So in short, yung mga political operators, the campaign strategists, the black ops people, they can influence heavily the perception of voters on certain candidates.
Yes, because debates are important, interviews are important because they provide you, the voters, information about what the candidate thinks, how the candidate stands on an issue. But as I said, if an interview is an hour and a half or 2 hours and a half, the voters, I don't know how many voters will really listen. So, and the reports will be the ones that will really capture their statements during those interviews. Okay. And you can, I think you would know that there are different ways by which the candidates themselves or their handlers would craft or portray their performances.
Okay, so you're talking about performance by a candidate in an interview, debate, or forum. But what if a candidate doesn't show up in the first place? Traditionally, do you think that could affect his numbers? Let's say in this case, Bongbong Marcos.
Well, it may affect his numbers, more especially if, let's say, all of the other candidates appeared in a presidential debate. We have not had a there was one presidential forum, right, that was held recently. And then in that presidential forum, Bongbong Marcos didn't appear. Whether that presidential forum would impact on voter disposition, we will know in the next survey because we did not capture it in this survey.
When is your next survey?
Our surveys are monthly. Unfortunately, Christian, I cannot give you the dates because it's policy. But it's monthly survey. So definitely the last survey did not in any way really, the non-participation in the interview that was held in January 22 did not have much of a bearing in terms of the voting support for Bongbong Marcos here.
So in this case, what would be a logical explanation here? The fact that Bongbong Marcos has hit 60% of voter preference, and his numbers are still steady despite the negative campaign against him because of the obvious campaign baggage that he has.
Well, I would say, Christian, that this is me talking as a political scientist rather than as a pollster. I will say that the son of the late dictator has rebranded himself successfully in this regard, to the extent that he differentiates himself from his father. He does not necessarily acknowledge what transpired during that time. I mean, not all of the things that transpired during that time he would acknowledge. At least the bad things, he would not readily admit that those things happen. Then he tries to emphasize the need to move on, and more recently, the question of the trust of uniting the nation. So you would not expect, and some people would say this, you would not expect someone who has actually been the cause of a division to talk about unity. But he's been harping on the same message. And this is important in any campaign. No? When you repeat the message, that is what gets stuck in the mind of the voters. Some people would not believe the message that he's delivering, but others may simply adhere to it or believe it for the simple reason that it's the message that they continually hear.
In this case, given the high numbers of Bongbong Marcos, do you think he can at this point afford to just cruise to victory without answering those very legitimate questions raised against him? His family's ill-gotten wealth, estimated at more than 10 billion pesos, dollars ang ninakaw sa kaban ng bayan. Yung ipinasole ng Supreme Court, more than $680 million. The myth of the Italiana gold. Can he afford not to respond to this issue squarely and just gloss them over and just cruise to victory because of his high numbers?
Well, I think he has responded to it, but in an indirect way. In the sense, what he has done is virtually just simply say that it's up to the courts, right? Or that certain decisions were made by the courts. He will not question it. To that extent, he's somehow directly admitting that there was wealth that was unexplained, and it was wealth that was withheld and eventually taken by the state for that matter. So without categorically saying that they did have unexplained wealth, he simply submits to what he believes is the rule of law, no? And that is the explanation that I think I've heard from the son of the late dictator, from Bongbong Marcos. Now, the other question is how voters react to these explanations and whether voters will accept his explanation. And somehow that's what you see in terms of the voting support, at least as a surrogate, as an indicator for whether people have accepted him for all the baggages that he, as you say, would carry. You have about 6 out of 10 expressing support for him right now. Will those issues hound him down to election day? Maybe, but that's something that we can only really know as the months or as the days pass, depending on how his opponents or how critics will frame it also.
Okay. How about the other issue? The fact that he hasn't detailed his campaign platform. Aside from talking about unity, yung generic na mga slogans or sloganeering na unity, 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 the fact that he hasn't come up with a detailed plan as to how he would address specific issues if elected president, can he afford to campaign on a vague platform and still win? Again, given this high number that he's now enjoying?
Well, again, Christian, it's a question of whether voters or majority of the voters will be quite attentive to the details of the platforms, whether they will be looking for those details or whether they'll be happy just hearing certain things that are more or less close to what they aspire, that will improve their plight without necessarily going to details as to how the next president will improve it. So again, that's something that we have to carefully study. Do Filipinos, for example, look for those details? Or would Filipinos just be simply contented with messages that assure them that the presidential candidate, the one aspiring to be president, would really lift or uplift their conditions for that matter?
Wouldn't that be, again, I'm asking you as a political scientist, wouldn't that be unfair to Filipinos if their candidates won't detail their plans but would only make them feel good and that's it?
Well, it would be unfair, really, to many of us, right? But I don't know exactly. I cannot substitute my judgment for the judgment of other Filipinos also. If you ask me, Christian, I would be looking for those details. I will be looking exactly what you would do in order to make sure that the economy really recovers from the pandemic. But I don't know how many Filipinos would go to that extent.
Okay. Let's go to the possible bandwagon effect of your survey. Common tong nire-raise na sa mga pollsters na sinasabi na, especially if you look at this high number, 60%. Parang inisip na iba, tapos na po yung boxing. Miski may iba silang preference, di naman mananalo yung choice ko eh. Might as well not vote or go for the front runner. Do you really see this so-called bandwagon effect? And what would you tell those voters with that kind of mentality?
If we really have a bandwagon effect, then the ones who were leading in earlier surveys in previous presidential elections would have won the presidential elections. Because they were leading also by not exactly the number that Bongbong Marcos has right now, but there was a significant distance between them and the ones who were second running. But eventually, those who led in prior elections, in surveys, but in prior elections, except for one, that's the late President Noynoy Aquino. Eventually, they did not wound up as the winner or the victor in the actual election day.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily apply yung tinatawag na bandwagon effect.
There's a bandwagon effect, and I don't know what extent there's a bandwagon effect, but it is cancelled out by what is referred to as the underdog effect. Where supporters of a candidate who may be lagging behind in the pre-election poll would be emboldened to work even harder and bring up the numbers of the candidate that they prefer. In other countries, there have been empirical studies on both the bandwagon and the underdog effect, and it has been established that it does not necessarily have that much of an impact in terms of voting, in terms of the outcome of the elections. In our case, there has not been any empirical study, but in our own surveys, we find out that the results of surveys do not necessarily impact in terms of voting decisions or affect the voting decision of the voters themselves. But that's our survey, Christian. So if we are used to
pero at this stage, less than 4 months before the elections and these numbers that we're seeing, can you say that somehow voters have made up their minds?
Well, I don't think so. What we've seen in previous when we did exit polls, the last one was in 2010, is that voters really firm up their decision on single winner competition. This is mayor, governor, or the president a few weeks before the elections. So that means you cannot say that at this point in time in January that they're firm about their voting decision. They would more likely change their mind, and the change will come about as a result of certain events that would really unmask the candidates that they might be expressing preference for.
Because my next question is, how solid is the support or preference for Bongbong Marcos based on your survey? Or was it even covered?
Well, I would say that if you look at the prior preference for Bongbong Marcos in the 2016 elections, he had a third of the votes. That would probably be close to what his floor would be. But it's difficult to suggest that there's a retention of the support that he had in 2016. This is just something that you can use as a possible base, but again, it will change. When you ask people, for example, when we ask people whether their vote will change, about half of them will say that there's a likelihood that it will change, or they cannot say whether it will change or not change. So you do have that large proportion of the voting public who are unsure as to whether they will retain or change their voting disposition.
So basically, the other candidates who are trailing Bongbong Marcos, they still have a chance to somehow eat up into the support base that he currently enjoys. Is that it?
Yeah, they do have a chance, and this is true now because you've seen the shifting voting decisions in the past. It will depend on what the candidates, the opponents of Bongbong Marcos would do. It will also depend on whether Bongbong Marcos would commit major mistakes that will reduce the level of support that he has obtained so far.
a part of your survey is the second choice preferences, right? So in the second choice preferences, the leading candidate is Manila Mayor Isko Moreno. What basically is the explanation for this? We can understand yung Bongbong Lenny, no? They're poles apart. How about Isko Moreno?
Well, the main reason why Isko is top in the second choice is because he's third in the first choice, Christian.
Okay.
So you would not expect Bongbong Marcos to be top second choice because he's getting 60%.
Yeah.
It will be difficult for Vice President Robredo to be top second choice because she's also getting close to 2 out of 10 voting support. So Isko with 8% would really be the recipient of most of the votes of people who said that they will vote for Bongbong or Vice President Robredo. But in the event that these two would not run, they would go to Mayor Isko Dumagosa.
But based on your survey, Isko Moreno and Manny Pacquiao are tied with 8% of the voting preference. Why not Manny Pacquiao?
That's why most of the ones who expressed initial support for Bongbong or Vice President Robredo would tend to go for Isko rather than Manny Pacquiao.
Nga, bakit nga? Tabla naman sila eh.
Mas gusto nila si Isko na second choice kaysa kay Manny Pacquiao. Maybe the sense is that he's more capable. His message is much more, they connect more to the voters. So there are various reasons for that. So they go more for Isko. The supporters of Bongbong and the supporters of Vice President Robredo would go more for Manny Pacquiao. For Isko Moreno rather than Manny Pacquiao.
Okay. Again, I'll ask you, my next question is directed at you as a political scientist. Kasi dito sa survey nyo, no, sa class, socio-economic classes or categories, C, D, and E dominated ni Bongbong Marcos, no? 50, 61, and 56% respectively. So let's go lang doon sa class E. 56% siya, si Leni Robredo is 16, Manny Pacquiao is 20. Supposedly, this is the support base of Manny Pacquiao. Kasi doon siya galing, di ba? Tsaka si Isko Moreno. How do you explain the fact, at least based on this particular survey, Bongbong Marcos beating Manny Pacquiao and Isko Moreno in those socio-economic classes?
So yung message of Bongbong cuts across basically those socio-economic classes. Despite what was believed to be the equity of the masses of Manny Pacquiao or Isko Moreno, it's more the message of Bongbong that rings, that gets attention and support from Class E, from the lower socioeconomic class.
So parang beating them in their own turf.
Yes, although Class E is a small group, Christian, it's about 15%.
Ang pinakamarami among D, C, and E is what?
D, which is about 75%. And then Class C is about 10%.
So
in this survey, we did not, among our randomly selected respondents, none could qualify into Class AB.
Oh, yeah. Ang taas pa rin. Kasi sa Class D, Bongbong Marcos is 61%. Lenny is 16. Manny Pacquiao is 7. Isko is 8. Ping Lacson is 5. He's the runaway winner based on this survey, if elections were conducted at this time.
If the elections were conducted at the time that we conducted the survey, yes. But if you talk about whether this will be retained and whether this is predictive of what will happen in May 9, my answer is a definite no.
Because
there are certain things that will transpire, things that the candidates will do, events that will impact on the voting support of any of the candidates here. And those are things that will really affect voting decisions. As I mentioned earlier, that's why you use dispositional. It's voting disposition. It can shift, Christian. How many Filipinos are favoring a political party? Not many, right? That's about 1 out of 100. Or at most 10 out of 100 saying, I favor this political party.
Negligible.
Our political parties are weak. What type of elections do we have? It's essentially a personality-oriented election. So what will happen here is that if these personalities, if their image is tainted by events or by their own mistakes, then both the voting decisions will shift. And that's the reason why I say there are many things that we cannot in any way project that will definitely impact on voting decisions.
In the case of Leni Robredo, how come the numbers are basically the same? Parang static siya, di gumagalaw.
I don't know exactly kung it's a question really of messaging on her part. The main message of, I think, the Vice President came out only at the beginning of the year, right? Yung gobyernong tapat, ang buhay ay aangat.
Angat buhay lahat.
Huh?
Angat buhay lahat.
Ang angat buhay lahat. Whether this message is something that really is appealing to the public. Well, what we say is that if it's not changing, that means that there's a possibility, there's a need for the campaign team to change the message. But whether that change in messaging should come about now and what message, that's something that I think we can leave to the campaign team to decide on.
Okay. Now, I think yesterday I saw a news report where the Comelec spokesman was quoted as saying that the election body was mulling over the possibility of issuing guidelines for pre-election surveys. For instance, mandating or directing groups like yours to identify who commissioned a particular survey and more to be more transparent as to the questions asked. What do you think of this?
Well, there's a Supreme Court decision on that because the Comelec has done that, and they have required us to really submit to them who are the ones who are subscribing to the surveys, because the subscribers would eventually, if they're connected to a political group, the subscription has to be reported in their SOSE, in their statement of campaign expenditures. That's decided by the Supreme Court. We will abide by the Supreme Court decision there. As to the questions are open. When we do media releases, the questions that we ask in the survey are included. The technical details of the survey are all published on our website. If there's anything else that is needed that we need to explain, we will provide this. So far, we have been transparent about both the questions and the methodology. And this is a non-commissioned survey. So that means that we do not even have to say who commissioned it.
Okay. Pero when it comes to commission surveys, are you supposed to mention them, who commissioned the particular surveys?
Normally, commission surveys are embargoed on our end and on the part of the commissioning entity. But when the results of the survey are released, and we find that the results that were released come from the survey that we conducted, then we confirm that this is a commission survey, and then we identify who is the commissioning entity.
Oo, kasi ito in reality, ito po yung nangyayari, no? Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this is wrong. Okay, so pag may mga commission surveys, hindi kayo pwede mag-release nun, di ba? Unless i-release or payagan kayo na nag-commission. Pero ang ginagawa ng iba nag-commission ng survey, they leak it, di ba? Through media. Forcing you to confirm.
Mm-hmm.
Para meron silang deniability, para hindi mo sila yung nag-commission. Di ba? These things are happening.
And then normally when media informs that there is this release that they got, we ask the journalist or the broadcaster to provide us that information, and we confirm that it's a commission survey. Then we identify who the group or entity that commissioned the survey is.
How about, as a final question, how about those who tap the services of Pulse Asia when it comes to rider questions? Are you supposed to identify them also?
The same rule applies. Our contract basically applies an embargo on both commission and surveys and rider questions. But when a rider question is released, then we have to confirm that it is ours, and then we will eventually have to identify who was the group that included that as a rider question in our own survey.
Okay. Professor Ronnie Holmes, thank you for joining us again on the program. Thank you for answering our questions.
Maraming salamat, Christian. Good evening.
And we're going to take a quick break. After the fact, we'll be right back.